Projecting African Migration to America, a Demographic Forecast to 2065. The story of African migration to the United States from 2025 to 2065, set against its historical backdrop and alongside other racial groups, reveals a striking picture of America's changing demographics. This exploration draws on projections from Pew Research Center's 2015 report, Migration Policy Institute data, and U.S. Census trends to estimate African arrivals over the coming decades, tally the total since 1513, compare these figures to other immigrant groups, and track the evolving balance between African-descended and white European-descended populations. The year 1965 serves as a key turning point due to the Immigration and Nationality Act, which reshaped migration patterns. Spanning both forced and voluntary movements, these estimates highlight continuity and change in America's racial makeup. Decade by Decade African Migration, 2025 to 2065. Looking ahead from 2025 to 2065, African migration builds on a foundation of roughly 2.4 million African-born individuals living in the U.S. in 2024, with about 50,000 arriving each year. Over the next decade, from 2025 to 2035, a modest uptick in arrivals is expected, adding over 500,000 newcomers and bringing the African-born total close to 3 million. The following decade, 2035 to 2045, should see a slightly smaller increase, pushing the total past 3.5 million. From 2045 to 2055, growth slows a bit more, with nearly 500,000 arrivals lifting the total near 4 million. Finally, between 2055 and 2065, arrivals continue at a steady pace, resulting in a range of 4.4 to 4.5 million African-born residents by 2065. Over these 40 years, nearly 2 million new African immigrants are projected to arrive, nearly doubling their population in the U.S. This growth stems from economic opportunities, education, and Africa's expanding population, though a broader slowdown in immigration tempers the pace. Cumulative African migration since 1513. The African presence in what is now the U.S. began with Juan Garrido in 1513, the first documented African arrival. By 2065, the total number of African-born individuals who have come to America is expected to reach between 4.8 and 4.9 million. This includes a few 100,000 who arrived before 1865, mostly through the slave trade, with a small fraction arriving as free individuals, followed by a modest 81,000 between 1865 and 1965. The Real surge begins after 1965, with numbers climbing from 81,000 in 1970 to 2.45 million by 2025, and then adding the nearly 2 million projected through 2065. This total reflects only foreign-born Africans and underscores the transformative effect of the 1965 Immigration Act, which opened doors to voluntary migration after centuries dominated by forced arrivals. By 2065, over 5 centuries of African migration will be defined largely by this post-1965 voluntary wave. Comparison with other racial groups. When compared to other immigrant groups, the nearly 2 million Africans expected between 2025 and 2065 fall behind the much larger flows from Asia and Europe but surpass those from Latin America. By 2065, projections suggest a foreign-born U.S. population of 78 million, with Asians leading by a wide margin, followed by a declining share of Hispanics and a rising share of whites. Africans, alongside Caribbean-born black immigrants, will form a notable portion of this mix, with African-born individuals making up about half of that group, totaling between 4.4 and 4.5 million. Historically, European migration before 1965 far outpaced African arrivals, but since then, African growth has gained momentum, trailing only Asia's projected dominance by 2065. African versus white European-descended populations, 1965 to 2065. The growing African-descended population, compared to those of white European descent, shows a shrinking demographic divide. In 1965, with a U.S. population of 193 million, whites made up the vast majority, while blacks, including a tiny fraction of African-born individuals, were a much smaller group, a ratio of over 7 to 1. By 2025, with a population of 340 million, whites decline noticeably, and blacks, boosted by 2.45 million African-born residents, narrow the gap to about 4.6 to 1. This trend continues over the decades. By 2035, the ratio dips further. By 2045, it tightens again, and by 2055, it approaches 3.8 to 1. By 2065, with a population of 441 million, whites shrink to less than half, while blacks hold steady, bringing the ratio to 3.5 to 1, with African-born individuals numbering 4.4 to 4.5 million. This shift, driven by African immigration and a declining white share, traces back to the lasting impact of the 1965 Act. Conclusion: African migration, projected to bring nearly 2 million newcomers from 2025 to 2065 and totaling close to 5 million since 1513, represents a significant yet secondary stream compared to Asian and historical European flows. Over a century, the African-descended population steadily chips away at the white majority's dominance, moving from a 7.6 to 1 ratio in 1965 to 3.5 to 1 by 2065. Rooted in the immigration reforms of 1965, these trends point to an increasingly diverse America through 2065.